A warm welcome also from my side. Thanks for the invitation. But without further ado, I think we should start because we have, of course, some time constraints as always. And under this headline, Africa-EU relations in the era of COVID-19, in this second session, we have a very challenging and interesting topic, Africa-EU migration in an era of COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 obviously being the one topic that is of highest concern to most of us at the moment. So I think this topic, how will the situation influence migration from Africa to Europe, or migration within Africa? How has it already changed? What are the consequences if the global economic situation deteriorates further? I think these are all questions we are here to discuss, and I think we're happy to have some eminent experts on the topic here who will enlighten us, and that is on my left, Mr. Charles Quenin, and on the right, Dr. Ayo Odusola. So I think we start on my left. Dr. Quenin is the Regional Director for Southern Africa of the International Organization for Migration. I think you're all aware with the IOM, the foremost international organization dealing with migration issues. It has 173 members, I learned, even including the US of America. So you're well positioned to discuss that. You have been in the country for 4 years after other experiences in Africa. And I think without further ado, I simply hand over to you. And as before, it's 20 minutes each, and then we have a Q&A session. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Dr. Lotz. Distinguished delegates, let me recognize Ambassador Nkosi, the Nigerian High Commissioner, and other distinguished colleagues, all protocol observed. First, let me thank Professor Ade for inviting IOM and myself to this important meeting, and also to thank IPATC for this meeting to discuss this topic of Africa, EU, migration in the era of COVID. I think it's a very timely and very interesting one. And for me, having worked over 30 years, spent 30 years of my life in doing migration, I think this topic for me is very complementary to the previous discussion. So I prefer to focus more on the other side because we've already discussed the contemporary perspectives on the policy side, and I think it would be good to also look at some of the operational and practical side, because at the end of the day, we have to kind of operationalize the policies to support the migrants, the refugees, the IDPs that we talk about. And having been involved personally in a number of these processes, I would prefer to actually highlight just a few points to enable us to have ample time for an interactive discourse, just to reflect on a few things, because the Africa and Europe have historical relationship which has been structured, multilateral partnership through the EU and the AU in a number of areas. But I must say that when it comes to migration, to me, it's been quite recent, and I've been personally involved in it, from definition of the Africa diaspora in Trinidad and Tobago in 2005 to the drafting of the Africa migration policy and its adoption in Banjul, and the EU Africa Joint Declaration on Migration and Development in 2006, as well as the EU Africa Migration and Mobility in 2014. So I'm stating all this just to take a step back to say that the EU-Africa migration relationship is also framed in a certain context. It's not just recent, because based on the Valletta discussion, we look at the political declaration and the action plan. And for me, it brings everything to the fore, what we're doing now. Because I was in Valletta, part of the discussion from Brussels to various countries and the final adoption in Valletta. So I've just decided to just reflect on a few points, which will also take us back in the memory lane, bring us to the current state where we are and what we're doing. Because what we're doing now, for me, is influenced and inspired by a lot of these frameworks which have been adopted in the past. And to recall the Valletta Summit, especially the political declaration, during which both Africa and Europe expressed their concern about the sharp increase in flows of refugees, asylum seekers, and irregular migrants, and agreed that the first priority in this context is to save lives and do everything necessary to rescue and protect the migrants whose lives were at risk. That is one. The other point that I would like to outline is the fact they also agreed to respond decisively and together manage migration flows in all their aspects and undertook to scale up their joint efforts in preventing and fighting migrant smuggling, eradicating trafficking in human beings, and combating those who exploit vulnerable people, both in Europe and in Africa. They also reiterated their firm commitment to respect international obligations and human rights, respect for the dignity of refugees and migrants, and protection of their human rights regardless of their status. And the other point that I would also like to underline the fact that Africa and the EU acknowledge the maturity of their dialogue on migratory issues and express their strong political commitment to pursue their joint actions through existing bilateral and regional mechanisms, including the Rabat and Khartoum processes and the migration and mobility dialogue, while promoting their operational aspects. And I'll be giving some statistics, and I'm glad that the German ambassador is here, so I took particular interest because I think it will be interesting for you to know the support of the German government as well as the EU. And that is why I'm just stating this, just to put those operational aspects into perspective. And to note that they also committed to allocate appropriate resources to the implementation of such concrete actions using all existing instruments, along with the newly set up EU Emergency Trust Fund for stability and addressing root causes of irregular migration and displaced persons in Africa. So I'll come back to this shortly, but just to note that this was the political declaration of the Valletta Summit. But the political declaration also came with an action plan which focused on 5 key areas, notably development benefits of migration and addressing the root causes, legal migration and mobility, protection and asylum, prevention of and fight against irregular migration, and also return, readmission, and reintegration. And anytime I talk about return, reintegration, and readmission, it always takes me back to the memory lane because I remember just for this, in Valletta, we had this meeting from 9 a.m. to 4 a.m. the next day when the presidents and everyone was coming, so we have to really wrap up to get the political declaration and the action plan ready for the presidents and heads of state. And that tells you how difficult the issue of migration between Europe and Africa has been, which has been discussed previously. But having said that, it's also important to note that the Global Compact has also provided some kind of a level ground in the field of multilateralism in the way migration should be managed. And to refer to the summit that resulted in the issuance of the New York Declaration, providing the development of 2 global compacts, which were adopted in 2018. It's the Global Compact on Refugees and that of Migration, which was adopted in Marrakesh, which also provides some framework in the way migration should be managed. But then, when we look at the COVID specifically, it's clear that the measures taken by various governments to address migration has actually had a lot of significant impact. And to note that it has resulted in an unprecedented restriction in human mobility and migration for that matter. And that has actually changed the face of migration and the way we travel. After 9/11, we realized that the way we travel changed because the focus at the airports was more on security. Now it's more on health. So that brings into focus the fact that there is a direct nexus between migration and health. Because as we cross borders, migration has a public health implication. And that is why now we have all this international health regulation doing PCR tests, and that changes the standard operational procedures, even in the way we travel now. So we cannot, avoid that. Secondly, the socioeconomic impact. That has already been discussed, so I'm not going to get into that. But just to mention the UN Secretary General's policy brief, which underlined that despite the fact that the coronavirus has hit almost every aspect of our human life, developed countries, developing countries, rich and poor, everyone, it does not discriminate, it does not know borders, it does not know richness, it does not know poverty, it's hitting everyone. And that also brings me back to the condolences expressed by previous speakers to our former president, Gerald Rawlings, who unfortunately passed away yesterday as a result of the corona, which was rather unfortunate. But just to say that the corona has had significant impact, especially on those who were already on the move, as underlined by the Secretary General, especially migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, most of whom actually got stranded in many countries, for which we have had to assist and support. Now, when we look at the figures provided by the Africa Center for Disease Prevention and Control, in Africa, it's estimated about 1.9 million people who are affected, of which we have about 46,000 fatalities with high recovery rates, of which South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, and Ethiopia are some of the very high countries, affected countries. But then now, when we've had signed an agreement with the CDC to support in 4 areas. 1, disease surveillance, information and data management, capacity building, laboratory diagnostics, and human resource development. And the laboratory diagnostics, as part of our support to address this, our office in Pretoria, we've just opened our laboratory and started testing for PCR, just to assist as part of our international migration service, especially first to the UN families, which will extend to others, of which you get the results within 2-3 hours, because if you have to travel, we have to be able to expedite that. But then the next point I would like to make before I go on to some of the operational aspects, where I think we also have to put our minds together on how do we collectively work together to provide assistance and support to migrants, because at the end of the day, migration is about human beings who are affected, but how do we assist them? We're talking of human rights, we're talking of people getting, the restrictions on human mobility, the health, the security. How do we deal with all this, especially on issues of immigration and border management? How do we support governments? How do we change mindsets? And when we just worked together with the AU to publish the first Africa Migration Report, I was hoping that I would have got the hard copies that I would have shared with you, but unfortunately, we haven't received it as yet. But once we receive it, we'll make sure you all get copies. But having said that, it's online, so you can go online and you can get the soft copies as well. But the African Migration Report takes a distinct regional approach to inform knowledge on migration in Africa, because the first edition, which is challenging the narrative, aims to deconstruct the negative perceptions of migration in Africa by addressing the contextual realities and bringing to light the practical interventions, evidence-based knowledge of what the realities of the situation are. And I think that has already been underlined by Ambassador Nkosi, so I wouldn't go into that. But the important thing is that most of the mobility is intra-regional, and most of the cross-border trade is by women, about 70%. And that is why I think it will be important, Professor Day, as we have such discourse, it will be important to underline 2 issues. 1, how do we, as Africa, talk about Africa continental free trade without talking of facilitating the human mobility of migration? When in actual fact, we talk of free movement of goods and services. Our heads of states have adopted the continental free trade. What about the free movement of persons? How do we expect the goods and services to move without the people moving when we know that the goods and services are moved by the people? So I think that's one area where we have to focus. And secondly, to underline the fact that there seems to be a kind of misunderstanding when we talk of free movement of persons, because it seems to give the impression that there is a violation of sovereign borders, as if we can just crisscross borders without any intervention. So I think it's important for us to underline the fact that what we are talking about is the facilitation. That is facilitating free movement of persons. As I sit here, my brother Ayo is a Nigerian, Professor Adio, Nigerian. For the West Africa, even when we talk of free movement, we still go through immigration, we still go through security. All that we're talking about is relaxation of visas. To go to any of the 15 African countries, you don't need a visa. That is what it amounts to. But you still have to go through that. So I think we have to address those concerns by our government. But having said that, let me quickly move to the support by the EU, because we've talked about Valletta, we've talked about the EU Declaration on Joint for Migration and Development. And to say that with more than 360 million euros from the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, which is as a result of the Valletta Summit, I would really like to thank the EU through you to the EU member states for the support to IOM, because when we put all together, the EU is the biggest donor to IOM. But when we're talking about the 360 million that has been allocated to us, especially first and foremost for the 26 countries in the North, Sahel, and Horn of Africa, for 6 priority areas: capacity building, protection and vulnerable returns, return assistance, awareness raising, migration data, and community stabilization. I would like to underline that since December 2016, when this was launched, the support of the EUTF through the joint initiative of the first comprehensive program, we have assisted over, let me give you the statistics here. First and foremost, the Global Strategic Preparedness Plan, we have about 282 million. Out of this, about 42 million is from the German government, for which we are really very thankful. And in the Southern Africa region, we have a significant contribution from the German government to Zimbabwe and DRC in particular. But then, when we talk of the assistance, as of 30th September in the Sahel and Lake Chad region, about more than 60,000 migrants in transit have been assisted to Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, Niger. And over 26,000 migrants stranded in the desert have been assisted via search and rescue operations in Niger. More than 45,000 migrants assisted with their return. Out of this, about over 3,500 were assisted through the EU TF COVID-19 Emergency Fund, which have facilitated a lot of through many humanitarian corridors. And more than 72,000 will be assisted with reintegration assistance at the end of this program. And I talk about the reintegration because we realize that assisting migrants to return without the reintegration assistance, there is always the propensity for secondary immigration. They will go back. So it's important that at least we provide that kind of support. And for the German government, for community stabilization in Niger and Burkina Faso, they've already received 15 million in new pledges, which has been earmarked. And again, we are very thankful and very grateful for that. Now, when we look at the North, where we have a lot of migrants, which tends also to give an erroneous impression. I was looking at the film you showed at the beginning of the program. The narrative has to change because we keep seeing all this, but the numbers that go to Europe, as a matter of fact, is just, for me, insignificant, to be honest with you. During the Arab Spring, I was in Geneva as advisor to the Director General for Africa. We assisted over 270,000 migrants from Libya to about 36 African countries. Of this, only about 25,000 went to Lampedusa. Do the mathematics. So when we look at the bigger picture as to the actual movement, the mobility within Africa, and the numbers that cross over, because we see that more on TV, in the news and things, it tends to give a different impression, but I think we have to get the narrative right. And once we get the narrative right, I think it will also help us to provide adequate responses to address these issues. And I recall very well, in Valletta, Madam Zuma, who was then the chair of the African Union, even asked us to close our site in Agadez. He said, IOM, close your site because of the outcomes of the Valletta Summit, where there was a lot of debate about using European travel document to facilitate the return of Africans. So for them, they were going to use it as a kind of a center because Niger is a member state of ECOWAS. I told the AU, I said, no, not because I work for IOM, but because before you close it, let's go to Agadez, Look at what is happening. After that, you can close it. I invited ECOWAS, AU, Olawale was the director of social development, and the director from ECOWAS. We went there, they saw it, they said, Charles, we cannot close it. I said, thank you, tell Madam Zuma. And that is why it is there now. So sometimes we have to get the reality, get evidence-based information with the statistics to enable us make, evidence-based policies to guide what we do. And now let me come to the conclusion. For protecting migrants, especially in the North Africa region, and thanks to the European Union and the European Union member states, we've assisted over 181,000 stranded and vulnerable migrants who were supported with the voluntary return assistance. More than 92,500 migrants were assisted with the post-arrival reception and reintegration assistance, while the flow monitoring points, we've done this in 71 sites. And when I talk of flow monitoring, I'm talking about migrants passing through ungazetted borders, irregular channels, because irregular migrants don't normally pass through normal channels, the regular borders. They use other channels, so we try to intercept it to get the right figures. And so for Southern Africa, we're collecting the data from various sites. For now, I think Tunde is in charge. We collected over 4,300. And now we have the Regional Migration Data Hub, for which we are doing analysis, and we'll be coming up with the Regional Migration report. And we look forward to working with all of you. Also, on the awareness raising, we've done over 14,800, almost 15,000, have been organized to inform migrants, to enable them make informed decisions about whether to migrate or not. You can't stop people from migrating. We can only help them make the right decision in a timely fashion. And also, the migrants who have been assisted in the search and rescue operations, we saw those who were falling into the sea. The search and rescue, over 34,200 have been assisted, and the migrants response centers, about 38 of them. So to conclude, I'd just like to make a few suggestions. One, the COVID-19 pandemic clearly demonstrates the need for strong investment in global health security as a key component of well-managed migration systems to prepare for future public health emergencies. When this emergency struck, even to get a PPE, sometimes we had to import them. How long does it take to get here when borders are closed? So I think we have to invest a lot more in health systems in Africa. And also, given the need to make timely decisions to facilitate mobility in the post-COVID-19 context, it will be important to consider capacities along the entire mobility continuum, not only at physical or regulated borders or points of entry, but including airports, ports of, crossing the sea, and various points of entries, and also within a comprehensive approach to border management, which co-opts health imperatives. IOM has been advocating for integration of both the security and trade perspectives for effective and efficient border management systems. So my last word to you is to know that having discussed all these migration issues, it's important to know that for IOM, our philosophy is the fact that migration is not a problem to be solved. It's a human reality to be managed because it is inevitable, it is beneficial, and it is desirable. But the desirability depends on how you manage it. But if it's well managed, it's beneficial for countries of origin, transit, and destination, and also to the migrants themselves and to their families. So let's not see migration as a problem. It's a human reality. We cannot stop it. Thank you. And let's put our minds together to have a good policy.
Thank you, Ambassador. And first from the chair, you had 20 minutes for your speech, and you used exactly 20 minutes, so that's wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much. We will have time to discuss it after the second presentation, but I must say I was very impressed by your insightful presentation, and I think in particular I liked the conclusion that it is not possible to prevent migration, and it should not even a realistic policy goal. The challenge is to manage it so that it happens in a humanitarian and humanly way. And I think your organization, of course, plays a key role, and we are proud as a country also that we can do our contribution to support you. The second speaker, Dr. Ayo Odusola, is resident representative of the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP. And talking about migration, I think it's no coincidence that after that focus on migration from the IOM side, we have a more economic focus. And the second presentation, Dr. Odusola was chief economist and the head of the strategy for the Regional Bureau Africa. He has in particular focused also on the Millennium Development Goals, and he has published several books, including as lead author, a book on income inequality in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you very much for being with us, and I simply hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Dr. Locks, Excellencies, Ambassador Nkosi, Ambassador Bala, Ambassador Lisenberger, panelists, colleagues from IPAC, and particularly Professor Adebajo for really inviting me. And distinguished ladies and gentlemen, my job is very simple, because if you have listened to discussions right from the period we started it, mine is just to probably provide an overview of the entire discussion. But I would like to move from the operational dimension that Charles has just talked about into development dimension of migration. And as a result of this, I will just I will start with the link between migration and development. I won't waste much time here because I know a lot has been said about it. I just want to know, as Charles concluded, migration is a barometer of development dynamics. And the direction it goes shows what is the stage of development in that particular of origin and the country of destination. And that's as a result of that, what we need to do to address migration in a more meaningful way is starting to address the issue of development. And we should see it as a win-win framework, not as a zero-sum game. And in this regard, you have to look at it the way it serves as not only the drivers, but also the consequences of development. In terms of the push and pull factors, which I know Ambassador Nkosi mentioned a lot in the morning. And I think that's one thing which I think we need to really, really reflect more. Because once you put those enabling environment there on development, it promotes incentive for people to stay within and work along that line. Now, one thing which I think we have really underestimated, whether in advanced country or even in Africa, is the underestimation of the power of migration to development. It does not only serve as a major source of knowledge, skills, and networks, but also when you look at the country of origin, the remittances that go there, the kind of technology transfer, solidarity networks, and a lot of other things that are going there, it will be difficult for us to really advance development. And so also in the areas of, the destination countries, you see many countries using, when COVID-19 struck, you can see the power of migration showing itself in so many ways. First, here in South Africa, you then realize that the mining activities were completely paralyzed. Two, go to the US. All the major universities were crying wolf. Harvard, MIT, Stanford University, that most of their researchers traveled out before COVID-19 struck and they couldn't come back. It was a major, major crisis within the American university system. It really tells you that don't ever think migration should be seen from a pejorative sense. It is a propellant of development, whether you are developed, developing, or least developed. So that's one thing which I think is really very important for us to take into consideration. And in line with what Charles mentioned earlier on, unbalanced and sometimes wrong narratives of African migration. I think that's one thing which we need to really reflect very well on, and I think we need to really see how we address this. The narrative distortion reinforces the need for us to really retell the story the way it should be, because we have seen it moving in different dimensions and different directions. African migration is very complex and very diverse. It has a lot of historical dimensions, and I so much like the triology of migration that Ambassador Nkosi mentioned earlier on. Look at the era of slavery, look at the era of colonialism, look at the era of post-colonialism and neo-colonialism. You then realize that it's very difficult to detach countries that have been previously colonized from the previous colonial masters. And as a result of that, what can we do to look at the reality and create a win-win development framework using migration as the instrument? This is one thing which I think we need to really look into. It has the economic dimension, it has climate dimension, it has a political dimension in so many ways, meaning we've got to look at it holistically for us to have meaningful results. So the partnership between the African Union, as well as all Africa member states, as well as European Union, I think this is one thing which will help us to really look at it. One side of these issues would never resolve it. It will never. So we have to look at it and see how best we can look at it. I see migration as a major instrument of strengthening coalition and alliances between European Union and Africa and the rest of the world. So once we're able to really meet a kind of strategic collaboration on this, it will be easier for us to really move forward in terms of getting to the root causes of these issues. And again, migration crisis in the Mediterranean is shaping wrong perception of African migration, including several notions like the North-South movement. It's never like that. The movement is bicoasal, from north to south and from south to north. And again, the issue of risky migration, we only focus on the negative side. Please, we need to look at the positive side. And like Shad mentioned, if you look at those that travel through the normal channel, it's a very large proportion, which I will show very soon. And again, the issue of negative migration. I was in Morocco in 2014 when we were discussing the issue of migration, EU and African Union. And one thing that really tricks me, really baffles me in terms of how we move around this, is when about 2 ambassadors stood up and said, okay, let's talk about this migration in Africa. One, when an African travels to advanced countries, is a migrant. But when somebody travels from advanced country to Africa, is a tourist or a business person. Now, how do we reconcile this? I think there are a lot of things that we need to do in terms of having what they call strong advocacy on the right trajectory of migration and development. And again, the third one is what we usually call the countries' policy ambivalence on globalization. Globalization has about 4 different elements. It is about trade, it's about finance, it's about ICT technology, and it's about people. You cannot take the first 3 and leave the last one. No. There must be some element of consistency. So that's why there is need for us to have strong collaboration, strong partnership to ensure that collaboration stands the way it should. Because if you look at a lot of things that have been taking place in terms of the impact of structural adjustment program, which was as a result of the onboarding of globalization through liberalization of economies. You liberalize economies, the small economies and small companies in most African countries that are using even family resources cannot compete with large companies that operate in multiple countries. And as a result of this, it creates, some of them went into extinction. How do we reconcile that? Those that lost their job, how do we take care of them? So those are the kind of things which I think we need to look into in order to really make sure that this is fully achieved. And the other thing relates to getting the facts right about African migration. This is something that is very important, very, very important. In 2019, UNDP released Scaling Fences report, where we had opportunity to really discuss with migrants in countries of origins and countries of destination and those that were in transition. And many things came out of that, many facts really came out of that. The first is that not all African migrants are with low level of education. 2, most of them do not lack skills at all. In fact, some of them are well-rated international experts. Not all of them are from poor background, as we're often made to believe, and not all derived from countries in conflict. Not all at all. And as a result of this, if you look at the map we have on the right-hand side, now, if you see where the blue color is lower than something that looks like the dark blue or black color, it shows that the number of migrants within the country, that originated from a particular country, is less than the total number of migrants that are living in that particular country, that particular continent. You can see sub-Saharan Africa, where those that originated from sub-Saharan Africa were 23 million, but if you look at those that are living in sub-Saharan Africa, is 27 million, meaning a balance of 4 million coming from outside that particular region. And then the only very few continents can boast of that. North America, it can boast of that, and you can see that in terms of 7 million relative to 59 million. And you can see East Asia and the Pacific, as well as Central Asia, as well as Europe. That's the other side of Europe. Now, if you look at Europe, it's 66 million relative to 40, meaning many Europeans are living outside Europe. So that's the kind of thing that we have to. Those that originated from Europe, 66, but only 40 million live within Europe, meaning they live in other continents. So the issue is, how do we really use, it's an indication that that is really a development issue that we need to really address. And so those are the kind of facts which I think is very important for us to really know, what are the issues we need to really do. Some of the other facts, which I think, I won't waste much time on this because I realized Ambassador Nkosi mentioned it, where only 14% of the total global migrants originate from Africa, relative to 41% in Asia and 24% in Europe. And again, if you look at it, 94% of those that are crossing oceans, the ocean migrants are regular, and you can see that the number that arrived through the Mediterranean has been declining since 2015 due to a number of policies that have been put in place, already explained earlier. But I strongly believe that there's need for us to really look at this. And for us to really make sure that the facts are really corrected, that's the way, that's one of the beginning of the solution. Because if the facts are not right, we won't be able to get the policy right, and we won't be able to get the advocacy right. And this is one thing which I think is really very important for us. And IPAC has a very strong load in making sure this is really done. And if you look at South Africa as a destination country, in Africa, South Africa is a destination country. The higher the level of your economic sophistication, the higher the level of labor and labor complexity. And people will have to come from here. Even companies will have to source it from outside to make sure they meet the complexity of the economy. And this is one of the reality. About 4 million migrants in 2019 within the country, with representing about 15% of the total migrants in sub-Saharan Africa, which is relatively large. And one thing that is really, really good in terms of what the UN is doing, and particularly IOM, UNDP, and a host of other ones, is partnering on integration of migration through social cohesion. We are currently operating something here, which we call the Social Cohesion Program. The idea is, how do we fully integrate or create a kind of environment that helps to integrate migrants into the economies where they are doing well? And I just want to mention with high sense of responsibility, what is currently happening in Uganda. Uganda is one of the very few countries, in fact, I think it's #1 in Africa and probably #2 in the world, in terms of countries that is hosting a very large number of migrants. And those are the kind of things, and they are providing everything, and they are fully integrated into the system. And I think Uganda really, really is doing Africa proud in terms of this, and we need to see how best we can manage this. So the issue of social cohesion is very important. And on the issue of COVID-19 and migration, Mr. Chair, one thing which I know is that when we all experience complete lockdown and travel restrictions, it has a lot of implications. And you can see all countries running so helter-skelter because of the total lockdown. And as a result of this, it has affected so many activities. One, when we look at the breakdown of the global supply chain and demand system, it is completely in a mess, that all countries did not even know exactly what to do. And it's not only Africa, even Europe, even North America is even more complex than many other regions. Now, one thing which we have known is that definitely decline in migrant workers. Like I said, mining worker was a major thing in South Africa and the one in US which I mentioned earlier. Then the issue of how does it affect migrants? Migrants, so many ways, risk of contagion, so many migrants, contracted it, and some of them even lost their lives. Again, decline in jobs, decline in incomes, and in well-being. And there's so many things, even with respect to countries of origin, in terms of what have been, they have in terms of remittances, serious decline in remittances, and decline in networks and technology transfer. But again, let's look at remittances, which I think it was mentioned by earlier speakers. One thing is that the whole world is going to experience about 100 billion decline in global remittances in this year, and about 23.1% of it is from Africa. And if you look at the figure for 2018, which is 83 billion, that's about 3.5 billion, percent of GDP is very huge. And the need for us to really see how that is protected because it's a major source, not only to companies, but also a major source to households that are currently living below the poverty line. So high cost of remittances is, again, one thing. I know it declined by 0.01% during the COVID era. But if you look at the rate in Africa relative to other regions, it's 9.4% in Africa compared to an global average of 5%. We need to really see how we reduce this because it's going to be a lot of transformation mechanism for us to really do this. If we're able to do this, Africa will be gaining about 1.8 billion each year in terms of what we're likely to gain in terms of reduction in the cost of transmitting remittances. Now, the policy response, which I think is really one thing we need to do. Well, definitely, we all know there's hardly any household in let me just put West Africa, for instance. There's hardly any household that does not benefit from remittances in West Africa. And if that one gets caught up, meaning those people that are living below the poverty line, then they are really in a mess. And we need to really see how we do this, particularly in high-section basic services. Now, the government needs to do something quite innovative by ensuring that migrants are included in health coverage. It is very important. The contribution to the system, to society, the contribution to the economy is huge, and the proportion of what we need to cover them is just patent of what they contribute to the system. The cash transfer system as well as social protection. I think we need to do this so that we can maximize the benefit of migration. This is going to be how do we really move from use human mobility to advance human development in post-COVID era. And that's, I will just summarize some of the key issues here. The starting point is for us to promote safe, orderly, and regular migration, including the borderline migration, which UNDP is working with all other partners in Africa, where these border towns have to be well managed so that we create a kind of symbiotic relationship with them, and at the same time, create what they call head posts to be able to make sure issues of pandemic are fully addressed in border town. It will reduce the risk of transferring some of these communicable diseases to the neighboring countries. We think that is very important in moving the initiative forward. 2, we need to stop distortion of facts about African migration by investing in evidence-based narratives and advocacy. 3, we need to reduce cost of transacting remittances to less than 5% as opposed to the current 9.4%. 4, we need to scale up bold, innovative, people-oriented strategies to address root causes of migration. For instance, we now know that one of the greatest challenge to development in about 10, 15 years to come is climate change. How do we climate-proof our development strategies and programs? That's one thing. Technology is creating what we call high level of inequality, even within advanced countries or between advanced and low-income countries. How do we ensure access to technology is very important, and that's one of the things which we think is very important for us to do this. Now, one of the things which we know is a major gap in most African countries is that we need to link our educational system to labor market reality so that the skill content of our education helps to equip our youth to be relevant to themselves and the society. So that's one thing which I think is really very important, because if you don't look at the development dimension, we're just scratching the issue of migration in the face. 6, scale up policy advice and technical assistance to reduce inequality. Well, the only thing, as mentioned earlier on by previous speakers, I see that it's only balanced development that can make migration a matter of choice, not a matter of necessity. As it is a matter of necessity because we've not been able to address development holistically. I mentioned the climate-food development and human settlement programs. That's very important. We need to promote long-term solutions from humanitarian to development, especially on the social cohesion, on the integration of migrants into wherever they are, because they are contributing a lot and they need to benefit from that development process. And finally, I say building alliances, coalitions among states and stakeholders, particularly the African Union as well as the European Union, is a major thing. And I like this particular initiative because it's a way of talking to each other so that we can get what the issues are. And this will help us to do a lot. We need to really promote both bilateral and multilateral engagement on migration. We don't do this quite often. And one thing is that things can be done at multilateral level. The concrete action in terms of strategic action on the ground is at bilateral level. Why don't we really try to build alliances and coalitions that will be able to promote that kind of bilateral engagement? I know many countries have bilateral commissions. We need to do more of this because that is where the issue of migration can be addressed. And in conclusion, Mr. Chair, I just want to say, let me just start by saying that the distorted narrative about African migration is an ill wind that blows no one any good, including Africa and Europe. If you don't get the facts correct, if you don't get it right, we will continue to miss the point in terms of the solutions. And one thing which I just want to leverage is that one of the things that UNDP adopted here in South Africa is how can we turn the COVID-19 crisis into an economic opportunity? And this we've done in so many areas, including what we just launched about 2 weeks ago, the Impact Investor Map for South Africa. And that's the first to be launched in the world, in terms of showing the sectors that we can use to promote economic growth, that we can use to generate jobs, and we can use at the same time to dent poverty and inequality in the country. And there's so many things in terms of what we do: engagement with informal tellers, promoting what they call technology-based entrepreneurship development program in South Africa, and so many more. But what we need to really do is how can we use this forum and many other ones to promote evidence-based analytics so that the facts will be there to guide our policymakers. Commit to safe, orderly, and regular migration and integration to host communities. I've mentioned an example of Uganda. And finally, Mr. Chair, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we can't get anything done without strong coalition and alliances between Africa and Europe on collaborative solutions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and also thanks for keeping the time frame, 22 minutes, so we were close to the 20 minutes required. Thank you very much for that. I think both your presentations had one message, get the facts right, and only if we get the facts right, we are able to develop convincing policy solutions. And I think both your presentations showed how often the narrative that we all tend to use is actually not always very close to what's actually going on. But I think we immediately go to the Q&A session. We have some time for that, so I think I will collect perhaps four questions, and yeah, we just start over there.
Thank you very much. Abdul El Goni from the African Diaspora Forum. Actually, in the last 6 months, the core business of our organization changed from a human rights perspective to relief because of COVID-19, and we distributed more than 6 million worth of food, and we are still distributing, and the problem is still continuing. But actually, I was very encouraged by Mr. Chad's comment that this business of migration is about saving lives. One of the problems we have in South Africa is the living dead. We have hundreds of people who are dead with fear. They go out, xenophobia, they go out, police brutality, they go out, other issues. There are people who are dead economically. Johannesburg now wanted to do a policy that will stop every migrant from having a good business in Johannesburg, although they are very successful and adding value. So what are we going to do for those walking, living dead? The other thing is, for us, people are not using facts. ADF has a lot of hands and brains, and we wanted to put facts on the table. We wanted to do a lot of seminars. We wanted to do a seminar on migration and politics in South Africa. We wanted to do a seminar on the COVID-19 and criminality in South Africa. There are people who are saying criminality has increased after COVID-19. We wanted to do a seminar about migrant children education in South Africa and how can we make it better, use of social media against migrants in COVID-19 and fake news, and how to connect and invigorate our migrant academicians in South Africa. There are hundreds of them. How can we bring them together to add value to the fact findings about migration in South Africa and in relation to Europe? There are a number of ideas that we have, but we have a problem of logistics, and it's not much. I'm looking forward some people around here to come to us. We have hands, we have brains, short surveys, action research. We don't want scientific academic research, but we can put a lot of facts on the table. This is one point. The last point I want to mention is this, that I got from this meeting, is that there are two problems. I want to thank the organizers for giving me a lot of food for thought to share with my board and executive. But today, there is a lot of good information, good facts that is used behind closed doors. It's not out there for politicians to understand it. It's not out there for some activists to use it in improving social cohesion, improving understanding. This is one. The second one is the shortage of facts itself, which I'm looking forward for additional hands so that we can put more information on the table so that tomorrow is better than today, especially everyone here today spoke and said migration is a fact. We have to live with it, exactly like COVID-19 is a fact. We have to live with it. Let us put facts on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. El Goni. And I think next is the High Commissioner, Dr. Bala.
Well, I want to first of all thank the panelists. They have spoken so well. And I think the message they gave to us is that migration is good. And we should get all the facts. And now, good news. Good news doesn't sell. You have given us very good news about migration, how good it is. But people don't want to listen to good news. What they want to hear are bad news. Now, what can we do to sell this good news that you have about migration, maybe to policymakers, politicians, so that they have the facts and they realize the goodness in migration. Like I said, it doesn't sell. In fact, if you have a good news, you have to pay in order to advertise your goodness. Now, in this country, we have Nigerians who are doing very well, but people don't want to hear about Nigerians that are doing well in this country. But they would rather want to hear about some of us that are not doing the right things in this country. Now, you have assembled us here, we know, and we do appreciate the goodness of migration. But the common man in this country does not even understand. He doesn't even realize how good migration is for this country. Then, my question to you really is, what can we do to enlighten? I hear some mention of advocacy, but I think we need to do a lot more about enlightening people at the grassroots, because they are the ones who are usually and normally incited by policymakers and politicians who want maybe capture power. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. And I think the next is Mr. Sobokwa.
Thank you, Ambassador. So my question really relates to irregular migration. I think we like the Ambassador just said, we've had some really great insights about how good migration is. But some of the root causes of irregular migration emanates from the relationship that I would submit emanates from the relationship some European states have with African states. For instance, in the Sahel region, some European states use that region as a buffer kind of zone because they're seen as transit states into Europe. And so, for instance, Niger and Libya. And so they rely on them to stop migrants from passing through their territory long before they reach the northern African coast. So for instance, let's talk about Morocco and Spain. Over $17.6 million was given to Spain, to Morocco, by the Spanish in what was called, quote unquote, migration cooperation. And I really wanted to find out then, because what happens is that when we have these kind of migration cooperations, the migrants that you can't stop from migrating to Europe are going to find other ways. And so what you do is you stop them from migrating through mainland, and they find their way going through the Canary Islands, for instance, where Morocco is concerned. Just 2 days ago, we had 2,200 migrants who reached there, and there's an alert from the Canary Islands to say we don't have the capacity to receive them. What do we do with them? That's the first thing. And so I wanted to find out, are we likely to see more of this kind of buffering take place? As far as routes are concerned, with COVID-19, are we likely to see a change in the routes that are used instead of Malta, perhaps? Going through Malta in the east of the northern Africa, are we likely to see more of these kind of illegal movements? Because the truth is, whilst there have been less migrants moving to Europe, the lack of finances that has been caused by some of the impact of coronavirus has meant that really desperate migrants are finding illegal ways, more and more, to move. And so what interventions are we going to, our organizations like IOM, the African Union, the European Union, making to interject and to intervene in that? Thank you.
May I suggest that with regard to you were saying about leading the evidence-based analytics, that together we have to talk about reframing and reimagining migration post COVID, or COVID and post-COVID. And the second is in terms of disruption. We've seen like the global supply chain being disrupted. So what has been the consequences during COVID about the disruption in migration and returning and inward migration? And if I can draw a small parallel with what we saw in India, in that people returned to their villages, etc. And also with COVID not being a temporary thing, but it has basically shifted us into another dimension of how we're going to seek to exist. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and I would suggest that we start with a brief answering round before we have the next Q&A. Ambassador Kweni.
First question from is it Africa Diaspora Coalition? Yeah, thank you very much for your intervention. That is South Africa being a living dead, as you call it, with a lot of xenophobia attacks. And what are we doing, to stop this? First and foremost, I think, was it Ambassador Nkosi or one of the earlier speakers? And I will echo that. Issues of xenophobia or attacks against migrants. It's unfortunate that any time we talk about that, we refer to only South Africa. For those of us in the field who deal with governments, who deal with civil society, who deal with migrants, it's not. It happens in many, many other African countries. And like I just said, sometimes when you have African go to a developed country, you say it's a migrant. When you have someone from developed country come to a developing country, you say it's an expatriate. It's the same thing, depending on how we call it. But it happens everywhere. So it's unfortunate that we look at it that way. It's one of the narratives that we need to correct. And also to use this opportunity to really commend the South Africa government. For me, they have one of the very progressive migration policies. A lot of African governments will complain, but when you look at the realities, and I'm talking from facts, because I've been to 53 of the 55 African countries, so I'm not talking from books, I'm talking from my own observation. I've been to Lindela, the reception center, and what the quality of service provided there, you won't find it anywhere in any of the African countries. Despite the fact that a lot of the African countries will complain, and I'm telling you for a fact, because I go there, we meet the migrants, we assist them to go back to their countries. So we have to get that right. And even during the COVID, when borders were closed, the government was very generous to IOM. All the migrants were assisting. We got support from DERCO, from Department of Home Affairs, and from everyone. And we keep advocating that migrants should be included even in the Solidarity Fund. Because when they are exempted or when they are excluded, it goes back to haunt you. And we've seen that in Singapore, in Malaysia. Leave no one behind. When you leave them behind, it will come to affect you. So we have to get that right. And what we're doing, I briefed the SADC ambassadors recently about some of these issues, even the issue of opening borders, where it needs to be coordinated. In South Africa here, we have the SADC ambassadors task force team, which I chair, where we met, and I think the Nigerian High Commissioner, I think he participated in some of it before, where we provided assistance to migrants. So that is something that needs advocacy, it needs social cohesion, and we've been doing this through community dialogue in a number of the communities to address that. Because in all this, it's just more communities who are doing this, but it gives the country a bad name. Anytime we talk of xenophobia, everybody thinks of South Africa, which is unfortunate. It happens, we've been returning people from many African countries for similar reasons, except that is not coming out. So we have to address that. Two, the issue of the service to, especially the undocumented migrants, is a big issue that we need to address. A number of them, because of their immigration status, are unable or are unwilling to come out. We've been assisting, we've been working with a number of African embassies. IOM, we have, as I mentioned, we have a lot of funds from the EU, from the German government, from many, Irish is here, from Sweden, from Portugal, from a lot of this thing. The funds are there, but they fear to come out. In South Africa here, the policy, no policy exempts the migrants from accessing the healthcare system. It's just that because they fear that they'll be exposed and be given to immigration officers, they don't. So that is something that we also have to address. And then the last thing, the issue of the issue that the the Nigerian High Commissioner raised. Bad news sells, and I think it's not only about migration, it cuts across the globe, and that's the nature of the world. We live in a world of perception, so we have to work together to really get this thing right. We know there are a whole lot of Nigerian businessmen, Ghanaians, a lot of foreigners, and as a matter of fact, a recent study done by, I think, ILO, shows the contribution of migrants to the South African economy, which is about 5% to GDP. And these are some of the things that we need to discuss and bring it out there so that we see, the nationals and everyone will see. If when you look at the statistics, South Africa hosts the bigged number of migrants within the SADC region. The SADC region has about 7.9 million migrants, about 4.2 or 5.2% in South Africa, which is the biggest receiving country in the region. But when you look at the statistics, most of them are from the SADC member states. About, is it 4.3 or 7.3 from other African countries? Even the number of migrants from European countries are even more than the number of migrants from other African countries. We have to get these statistics out there. And that is why we've established the Regional Migration Data Hub, where we are collecting this data. And we'll be coming out, we are working on a regional migration report for Southern Africa so that we get this right. But we have to work with civil society, with government, in fora like this to get it right. We have the Migration Dialogue for Southern Africa, where we do this with SADC. We have it with ECOWAS. We have it with COMESA, with all the rest. But we have to work collectively together. As to how we can work together to enlighten the general public, no matter how much we work together, there will still be a lot of people who will still not get the information. It's just like the efforts being made to educate people about the free movement of persons. Still, a number of countries have still not adopted it. We've been doing a lot of effort, but we have to continue, we have to sustain it, and we have to have a broader coalition in advocacy to reach out, create awareness, to be able to address that. And in fact, some of the funds we're getting from the European Union, Germany, and everyone, US, also includes the risk communication. That is the information, education, and communication to the local communities to let them understand that the migrants here are not here to take your jobs. The reality of the fact is the fact that most of the jobs that we claim migrants are taking are not done by the local communities. The criminality, look at the statistics. It's not the case. But then we need the evidence to be able to debunk all these kind of erroneous impressions, misconceptions, and the myth about migration. And as a matter of fact, one thing we have to also know, migration is not cheap. Those who travel actually are not cheap. When you find a very poor person, give him a visa, he can't even travel. I'm telling you, migration is quite an expensive venture when you see what they go through. And the other fact is, when you give people the opportunity to travel, most of the time, they won't travel irregularly. They will take their time. In West Africa, how many governments are complaining? When you give people the opportunity to travel, they travel more regularly. No one will travel irregularly or using, traffickers or smugglers. But when we tighten borders, we close borders, it backfires on you. Migrants, as I said, you cannot stop migration. You tighten or you close borders, they will either use unauthorized channels or use the services of traffickers or smugglers. So what do? We are only subsidizing the work of smugglers and traffickers anyway. So let's see how we manage it. And that is why I talk of managing migration. Otherwise, we will use the wrong instruments to address it, and it will backfire. And finally, the issue raised by Nezo on the EU using the Sahel as a buffer. I think I made mention of it. Why Madam Zuma asked IOM to close our center in Agadez, that I had to mobilize, ECOWAS and this thing to go there and see, because that was the perception. And as a result of the Valletta summit. As to whether COVID-19 will change the routes, yes, it could. Because when migration for me is it's a flow, it's like a river. When you block the normal waterway of a river, powerful as migration is, as I mentioned, they are going to find alternative routes, which may not be the regular routes. You cannot stop them. When you see people crossing the Mediterranean, it's because they are desperate. They will find ways to go. So with COVID, people are more likely to change their routes. People are more likely to be more vulnerable and fall into the hands of traffickers and smugglers because they are desperate, they've lost their jobs, they are looking for jobs. A lot of families depend on migrant remittances. Now, where is the migrant? These are the same people who were remitting their families. And IOM, we had to change the way we look at migration, and we came up with what we call MICHIC, migrants in countries in crisis situation. During the Arab Spring, after returning over 270,000 Africans to sub-Saharan African countries, that was evacuation. We didn't provide any reintegration support. Ask me where are they? I can tell you a lot of them have gone back. Yes, because it was evacuation. Most of them because they were holding the Libyan dinar. I think their currency was, is it dinar? They were holding the money, they couldn't remit. So when we were moving them, they bought a lot of items, TV sets, a whole lot of stuff. Now, for the evacuation, it was life-saving, as I've already mentioned in my presentation. We said, look, we give you only 20 kilos. What happened? They had to leave them behind. Tunisia was kind enough, the government was kind enough to allow IOM to use their airspace. The whole airport was choked, fridges, TVs, and everything. They said, IOM, please get these things out of here. We are approaching our tourism season. We cannot get this here. We had to go to EU, the US, and everyone wanting money to get these things out because some of the tax have been removed. Where do we take it? So we have to look at even the fact that remittances is not only from developed countries. Even within developing countries, there is a lot. So how do we mobilize this, reduce the cost of remittances? So there are a whole lot of issues that we have to take a look at. So as to what is IOM doing with the EU to stop this, we've come up with the Africa Migration Report, where we're trying to change the narrative, get the facts right. We need to work together in terms of advocacy, working with civil society. Civil society organizations are very powerful. They are very helpful. And that is why during the Global Compact of Migration, we had several sessions with the civil society. We had a lot of sessions with the governments and partners. It takes a collective effort. So together, we shall win. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and hand over to Dr. Dussel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I think Charles has really attended all the questions. I'll just add a few things to them. I think in terms of supporting the provision of evidence, well, the beauty of it is that UJ is here, IOM is here, UNDP is here, and some other organizations are here. I think it provides opportunity for us to reflect on what are the things that we need to put in the public in terms of evidence that can be generated from what we have. And I so much like the Africa Diaspora Coalition, that they have a lot of facts, but it can be pushed out. And I think that's why it's good for you to be attending events like this. And I strongly believe Charles, I and Adi will discuss on how to take some of these initiatives forward in terms of how do we come together to provide evidence that can help us change the narratives on the ground. I think that's really, really very important. And I strongly believe we need to do something more concrete to get this one on. Now, Ambassador, I like what you said in terms of it's only bad news that sell, not the good ones. Yeah, definitely it's not. But we cannot just close our eyes. We'll continue to do our best to ensure that we reach those that are currently not reachable. And that's why, I always say every stakeholder in development has its own unique comparative advantage. Government can be very strong, excellent, efficient, effective, but there's no way they can reach people on the ground without the civil society organizations. So how do we bring them on board? How do we empower the civil society organizations to work with communities to engage and devise what they call community conversation strategy, where migration issue will be discussed? So I think this is where we need to do, and particularly, if you want to do this, we have to what we call focus attention on what we call the hot spots. Once we are able to do this, that's how to disseminate such information and it will get to the right people. But I think we need to engage the civil society organization more to be able to reach those people that are currently unreachable in order to change the narrative and making sure that things work the way we expect it. In terms of coping with migration and such, well, I'm happy IOM is here because that's their DNA. And what is really important is how can we, particularly the UN agencies, academic institutions, CSOs, empower and build the capacity of our immigration people. Because at times when the surge comes, they are overwhelmed. And rather than becoming more official, they become, they just brutalize people that comes their way. And as a result of this, I think we need to really find a way of how can we do. We have European Union, we have Germany, and they've been very supportive in terms of migration. What can we do to build the capacity of our immigration officers to deal with such when it happens? I think this is one thing which we have not been paying much attention to. And that's why we have a lot of challenges when such things really happen. Well, I cannot agree but more with you on what you said in terms of disruption of migration due to COVID-19. Well, it led to a lot of separation of families because one thing that thrilled me was when Harvard was taking government to court, when the government banned 7 countries, and they then realized that there's so many of their researchers from Iraq, from Kuwait, from so many of them, and they've already been banned. They can't come back, and the families are separated. So they went to visit their extended family where either their wives, children were in America. So this is part of the thing which is really, how do we really address that? We really need to find a way of getting this one resolved in a way that really helps to really address it. One lesson that emerged is that how can we turn the current challenges into opportunities? Migrants are not covered in the healthcare system. We need to do that. And how do we address the issue Charles mentioned, that even when those facilities are there, they don't want to come up because they don't want to be handed over to security officers? How can we engage both groups to ensure that this is fully achieved without leading to living in fear, as Doctor mentioned? This is something we need to do. We cannot just fold our arms. We can't rest on our oars until the objectives are achieved. So I strongly believe communication is very important. Let's reach out to those that can make things happen. We cannot just be pessimistic about migration. Let us be optimistic and reach out to those we think will be able to shape the opinion and make things work the right way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we have time for a second round of questions, and we already had some participants who raised their hands. I think first Dr. Golding, and then after that.
Thank you very much for permitting me to present some of my remarks. I wanted to just point out the global importance of the idea of a win-win Africa-EU relationship on migration. You know, the global implications of the aspiration for a win-win framework is enormous. In thinking about it, I'm drawn to the memory of Trump suggesting to put up a wall, right, between America and Mexico in 2017, and then to furnish the wall with solar panels. So put up the wall in exchange for energy security and for the wall to pay for itself. And so this notion of a win-win framework and the importance of it and what it could mean for other countries of the world and other regions of the world is important in terms of it setting a trend, a new cooperation framework for dignified globalization becomes very, very important. This aspiration of a win-win framework is also important in the context of ODA to African countries, you know, putting up a wall with solar panels, and I'm just using this as as a hypothetical example. Putting up a wall with the solar panels is a reflection of systemic hypocrisy, right? In development. And so when we begin to think of a win-win framework on Africa-EU relations on migration, you know, we have to be mindful of shared vision, common purpose, reaffirmation of values, and a good spirit, particularly now, you know, in the new world order and the geopolitical shifts. It becomes important to rethink and redefine and perhaps affirm a new vision for dignified globalization. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and we have a question from Dr. Warrior.
So I kind of like have two reflections, and the first one is, in as much as we're talking about adults within the context of migration, and the benefits the children and young people could actually accrue from that, how can we bring young people and children into this migration COVID-19 discussions, debates, or even dialogues? And my second reflection, in as much as Dr. Odusula has spoken about capacitating immigration officials, I think in terms of development and working with migrant communities and populations, we also need to think of capacitating the professionals who work from a psychosocial developmental perspective with the migrant populations as well. Because if the psychosocial and the mental is not okay, then that will impact their well-being in terms of them being able to be productive, either in the countries of transit or even in the countries of destination. So it's worth thinking about and reflecting further. Thank you.
Thank you. I see, well, two more, perhaps we can just take you three briefly, and I think that's the end of the list of speakers. So I think now, I don't know, I think you were first.
Thank you very much. My question is directed to Charles. Is there an index like a migration living well-being index where you measure where the country of origin that the migrant comes from, and in terms of access to infrastructure, social services, economic opportunities, how they perform, and then when they move, for example, in the South African context, with all the negative comments that have been said, which I agree and I empathize with, but what's the positive of how they're living well-being in terms of all the basic human rights and economic rights, and so that's my general question. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have Dr. Emmanuel.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to add that given the existing narrative and the available data that has been shared so far by the presenters, are there possibilities for any form of alliance between the AU and the EU, given their different priorities, like one security and the other one development? Are there possibilities to align to achieve a common ground for a win-win for all? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have Mr. Sobekwa.
Thank you. I suppose, let me start here. What, in terms of the partnership between the European Union and Africa and trying to get this win-win narrative solidified, what are we doing about the lack of repatriation agreements? I think there would be less of a need to spend money on reintegrating migrants if there were more agreements between European countries and African countries. I'll give you an example of what I mean. For instance, many of the times when African migrants are being brought back, they put on the border countries near, say, Niger and Mali. For instance, in Rosso, you've got them being brought near Mauritania and Senegal. In Oja, you've got them being brought near Morocco and Algeria, and there isn't really a synergy between these two countries. Are there efforts, policies that are being made to have these repatriation agreements made, especially because, that's just such a hotspot area? And talking about hotspot areas, I wonder, is there capacity, because we've now agreed that it's possible for COVID-19 to impact migration routes, is there capacity to figure out where those migration routes may change towards so that we can mitigate the impact? I mean, everybody here, whether you have a security imperative or a development imperative, we all agree that we want to save lives. And so are there other policy and capacities within these organizations to make those kind of interventions? I think we should be forecasting, because we know that the impact is there, and therefore be able to mitigate these. Thanks.
Thank you. Then I hand over to Ambassador Quenin.
Thank you very much. I think her comment, hers was more of a kind of an additional comment, not a question, so to speak. The question as to how to bring children into this dialogue, is that my understanding? Yes. Okay. Bringing children into such policy domain You see, when we do what we call the community conversation, or when we go to the communities, sometimes we do focus group discussions, depending on the issue at stake. But normally we focus more on specific groups. For children, the definition of children even varies from country to country, what is the cutoff point. So we would have wished that we deal with issues of children, because of course, migration, you cannot leave anyone behind. But I do not recall having any specific engagement with children, even though we do a lot, like sexual reproductive health rights, where we try to engage like sex workers, the youth, which we are doing in a number of countries in South Africa, I think in 6 countries. Depending on the subject, of course, we will have to engage them. But what is important is the engagement, especially of women, because now we have a phenomenon we call the feminization of migration, because we have a situation where we have many more women migrating than ever before, and having many more men who are now babysitters, because we believe that migration is now empowering women through exposure, through education, through income, which has changed the role of women in society, at the workplace, and even at the household level. And for that matter, it's important that we empower, if need be, the youth to be able to take on some of these roles through peer education in some of these things that we're talking about, advocacy. It's important when you are able to engage peer-to-peer conversation to change the narrative. I don't know if that addresses the issue. On the issue of the migration index, yes, we have what we call the Migration Governance Index, which takes care of exactly what you describe. And we do this with the Economic Intelligence Unit, where we've done it in many countries. We look at some of the socioeconomic dynamics and how we can use those very things you described to improve on the way migration is governed. And in fact, we've proposed to the APRM, how can we even use migration as one of the parameters for the peer review? And that is when there is a crisis and you have a lot of movement from a certain country, the capacity to manage those flows, which will also link to the how do we manage mass flow of people, which resulted in the Global Compact on Migration. So yes, we have that. What we are working on now is the Ease of Travel Index, which ADB has worked on, which IOM have also done a bit of work on that, because Africa has one of the most closed continents when it comes to moving within the continent. You go to Europe, they have the Schengen, they move freely within 28 countries. And that will explain to you why they have more intra-European trade, because they are able to move goods and services freely. In Africa, sometimes, for instance, I have to move from South Africa to maybe, I don't know, maybe let's say Mauritania. And I'm from a national where maybe Mauritania doesn't have an embassy here. I may have to go to Ethiopia, where maybe they have an embassy, to get a visa to go to Mauritania. But to go to Ethiopia, I need an Ethiopian visa. So you can see the complication. We are very close, and that, to a large extent, also explains why the intra-Africa trade is very low, just about 16%, the lowest in the world. So we have to open up. Sometimes we complain about visas and things, but I can tell you, to go to some African countries, I have had to go to some African country when I was advisor to the Director General. In Geneva, I was asked to bring a certificate of good conduct when I was going to meet even a foreign minister in an African country, and we talk of African integration. So sometimes when we talk about these things, we have to look at it more broadly and not just narrow the scope of some of these discussions. Within the continent, we are very close, and we need to open up through the AU is working on it, through the Africa Passport, through the continental, the Protocol on Free Movement of Persons. We will get there. A number of countries, I think we need 6 more ratifications. I think 9 have signed, and I think we need 6 more ratifications to get it adopted, ratified for implementation, just like we have the Africa Continental Free Trade. So yes, we have it, and we'll work on it. The repatriation agreement. That is, as I mentioned, the issue of repatriation was one of the very sticky issues that was discussed in Valletta. And one of the issues that was most contentious was the Cotonou Agreement, where you have to look at, it's an international law, where governments have to admit or accept your nationals. But it depends on which document you use, because the receiving government will have to recognize the travel document that you travel on. And that is where the issue comes, because it's very easy for a sending country to say, okay, I want to deport Nezo. It's easy to say that, but to deport Nezo, the sending country will have to prove that you are a South African or a Ghanaian or a Nigerian. But if they take you to the Ghana Embassy or High Commission and you say, I'm not a Ghanaian, the government cannot force you to give you a passport or visa or to go back. And that is why sometimes some of the host countries will impose visa sanctions when they think you are not cooperating. And that is what brings in the issue of readmission, where governments want to sign readmission agreements so that you agree to receive your migrants. And sometimes, of course, some of the governments also play cards, because for Africans, it's difficult. I can easily pass for an Uganda or a Kenyan or something. And especially when you look maybe Ethiopians or, Eritreans, some of the features look alike. So it's difficult to prove that I'm an Ethiopian or I'm an Eritrean and things like that. And I recall, sorry I'm taking a bit of time, but sometimes the practical examples put things in perspective. I remember in Valletta, one of the Eritrean delegates walked to me and he said, when we have an issue with you. As I said, what is the issue? He said, our statistics that we are providing, we've inflated the figures about the number of irregular Eritreans that we publish, because a number of them are not Eritreans. As I say, that is true. I won't deny that. We know that. When we don't have the mandate or the capacity or the competency to determine nationality. If I ask you, what is your nationality, and you tell me you are Eritrean, I can't contest it. I can only document it as Eritrean. So we know that some of them may not be Eritrean. Migrants will always use a country in crisis to seek asylum. We know that. But how do we do it? How do we address that? I said, it takes you and I to address that. So help us to help you. I won't deny that is true. So it's a very complicated issue. And as I said, AU thought EU was using Niger to deport people, and that is why Madam Zuma was saying we should close it down. But when you look at the reality of the situation on the ground, you realize that not all that glitters is not gold. And sometimes we have to look at the realities of the situation on the ground to make some of the very realistic and objective decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and Ambassador Odusola.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very, very brief. I don't want to stand between people and their lunch. So I just want to re-echo the win-win framework, because that's the solution. We have to find a way of evolving a system that is beneficial to EU and the African Union. I think that's one thing we have to do. I don't see both security and development being diametrically opposed. No. What we need to do, how can we develop a win-win framework through security development nexus? And then from there, once we have areas of commonalities, it becomes something we can use to drive the entire process. I strongly believe that's the best way to go. Because without a win-win framework, it doesn't elicit ownership and it doesn't elicit commitment. And that's one thing that is very important for us in terms of taking this one forward. On the children, Charles has really mentioned a lot about that. But I think there's hardly, while IOM is mandated to do issues relating to migration, UNDP is only mandated to look at the development dimension of it. Now, UNICEF is not mandated to do migration, but is mandated to deal with issues with children. How can we bring them on board? Because they understand the language of the children. And when we want to do anything relating to migration as it relates to children. And I think, Charles, that's what we may have to be thinking about in terms of looking at the UN approach to this, so that the various expertise and technicalities are brought on board in addressing people with different background. And finally, building psychosocial capacity. I think you're very right. One of the major things, changes in the UN now, just about a month ago, because of COVID-19, our insurance, particularly, I don't know whether it's the same in all the other UN, insurance, the one I hold, does not cover mental health issue and psychosocial issue. And then because of that, the administrator just wrote to us that, so sorry, we've discussed with insurance, it's now part of it. So that's the beauty of it. And I think that it should be the same thing at even private sector level, so to ensure that under situations like this, insurance that we are holding covers a social issue, even with government, national government, at all levels. And I think this is one of the things we need to really realize and continue to live with in a more harmonious way. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gwyn and Dr. Odusula, for your very insightful presentations and contributions to the discussions. Thanks to Professor Adebayo for organizing and hosting this event. I will not even try to summarize the discussion. Just some takes for me from that session. I think we really see that migration has far more positive aspects than negative aspects. It's something that also I think Europe still has to fully understand and to draw the right policy decisions. Europe obviously needs migration. And I think one of the conclusions that we see is clearly it's a question how to manage it. I think it's important and important that it was stressed what positive role our host country, South Africa, plays in this context. It's important to see that it's very much also an intra-regional African challenge, migration, since we always focus so much on the African-European aspect. And next to the major policy decisions that have to be taken, I think it's also important to see, to implement how important it is to focus on the practical challenges, things like training of immigration officers, of access to health. But I keep it with that. Thank you very much, and I wish you a nice afternoon.